afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to SETA D.C. for a panel on the Turkey's elections and its aftermath, the implications of the elections for the domestic and foreign policy. And we have, as you all see by now, Turkey had its elections on the 24th of June. The election results were not unexpected other than the votes of MHP. Most of the actually observers, at least in Turkey, were expecting a first-round victory for Erdogan, and there would be a contested elections in the parliamentary elections. Even when we had our first panel here 2 months ago, just before the announcement of the elections, our observers had the same expectations about the results. So today we have a great group of panelists to observe the elections, basically to examine the elections, evaluate the outcomes, and talk about its possible implications for U.S.-Turkey relations. And Burhanettin Duran, the general coordinator of SETA, couldn't able to come today. We were at the airport with him yesterday, but because of a last-minute inconvenience, he had to go back to Ankara. So he will join us with Skype, and he will provide us his perspective about the elections, his interpretations of the election results. Our other panelists, starting from the left side, Ambassador James Jeffrey, you all know him, Daniel Serwer from Johns Hopkins University, Michael Reynolds from Princeton University, and Mujeeb Khan from University of California, Berkeley. So we will start with Burhanettin Duran, and he will provide us an interpretation of the results. Can you hear us, Dr. Duran?
Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon from Ankara to everybody. First of all, I really wanted to be in DC to participate in this great panel, but because of the last-minute inconvenience, I can participate just by Skype. I want to express that I'm sorry for this. Well, these elections were critical from many perspectives. First of all, this is an election of transition to a new system, from a parliamentary one to a presidential system. So, Turkish electorate has decided to move forward into a new system under the leadership of Erdogan. The second aspect was about the future of Erdogan. In the first round, it is clear that Recep Tayyip Erdogan will lead Turkey to this new system with 52% electorate. If you look at the turnout rate, it is actually not high. It is 87% in the elections. This reflects the Turkish people's confidence in democracy. I will not go into the details of party campaigns and the reasons for all of the issues, but some points should be clarified. This elections was about the realities of the post-July 15 coup attempt period. You know, there was two main camps, electoral alliances, People's Alliance and Nation Alliance, and People's Democracy Party as a single party for competition in the elections. So that was an election of electoral alliances. The result was actually concluded, determined by the reality of these electoral alliances. Maybe the second factor was the strategic voting. In fact, these electoral alliances made it easy for voters to change their preferences from one party to another. But this change was largely contained to the blocks. I mean, electorals change their preferences within the alliance, not from one alliance to another. But certainly this created a very critical change in the result. Of course, the first result was Erdogan's victory to become a new president. But the second one is his party, AK Party, lost 7 or 8% vote. That must be critical for AK Party. And I think that AK Party leaders will try to analyze what happened. Of course, one basic explanation is strategic voters prefer Nationalist Action Party, the other partner of People's Alliance, as their party. So, but still, there is 10% gap between Erdogan and his party. For the next local elections, this is very critical. If this continues, if this gap and decline continues, AK Party will experience a major difficulty in the local elections to capture some metropolitan cities, including Istanbul and Ankara. So now, in spite of the victory, party is trying to analyze this decline. Another factor was, of course, the Nationalist Action Party's victory. I mean, during the election campaign, it was expected that this party will lose voters, even decrease to 5 or 6%, but it is clear that it's 11%, very near to this party's earlier experience in 2015. So this is because of the AK Party supporters gave their votes to this party. But in the end, the majority belongs to People's Alliance, but not to AK Party as a single party. So this is a new reality to confront Turkish political system in the next 5 years. In a way, there is a relatively long period of stability for Turkey and for President Erdogan. But at the same time, this stability is based on the support of Nationalist Action Party. So we know that this party started to support Recep Tayyip Erdogan, President Erdogan, after the coup attempt. And this support was actually given to Erdogan because of his strong fight with the PKK terror and FETA terror. So it means that this will continue to affect the shaping and future of Turkish political system in the next 5 years. Again, we have another new phenomenon, which is the success of People's CHP's leader, Muharrem İnce. This is very critical in terms of future because, yes, CHP lost 2 or 3%, but at the same time, its candidate, after 40 years, has become very influential in the campaign. He attracted many votes with the result of 30%. This is very critical for the future of CHP because, you know, for the first time, there is a new politician that can gather votes from different sectors. This will force the struggle of leadership within the CHP. Until now, we understood that Kılıçdaroğlu will not give up and will continue to keep leadership in his party. But İnce wants to be a politician in the future of Turkey. So there will be a struggle between İnce and Kılıçdaroğlu. We don't know yet what will be the result, But I understood that İnce is an ambitious one, is an ambitious a politician who wants to survive because in spite of these all problems. Well, another result from our elections is related to Good Party and Meral Akşener. Well, actually, it was not a success for this party and Akşener because it was expected to be higher in terms of votes. But still, there is a party with 10%. This is a newly established party, a breakaway party from MHP. So still, this could be considered as a success for this party and leader, Akşener. So this party will continue to be in the system, of course, in the parliament. But still, in terms of ideology and electorate, there will be a pressure on this party from two sides. One from MHP and on the other side from CHP. These two nationalist parties, secular nationalist parties, will make it very difficult, the Good Party, to place itself within the system. But still, we have 5 parties in terms of getting the threshold. So it means that this threshold is nonsense. Maybe there will be some initiatives to get rid of this threshold because it doesn't work anymore, especially after the implementation of these electoral alliances. It's rubbish. So, and again, one critical party was HDP, People's Democracy Party. Well, this party was very marginalized before the election, but during the election campaign, this party was brought into the center by opposition parties because it was regarded that if this party captures more than 10%, the threshold, then the first round will be against Erdogan. So that will be second round. But now, what we have now is there is People's Democracy Party over 10%, but at the same time, Erdogan has won the first round. So still, this party will continue to be influential in the parliament, but with the problem of trying to get rid of this marginalization. Because we know that there will be more efforts to continue the fight against PKK, even making some cross-border operations in Syria and in Iraq. So this will make a pressure on this party in terms of asking in which side you are. So this is not an easy position for this party. So as a result, I can say that Turkey's elections created a new period to institutionalize the new system, the new presidential system. The main agenda will be on that, and all parties, after the evaluation of the results, election results, they will try to finalize their party problems or problems within the party, and they will try to continue these electoral alliances, basically 2 alliances. And this will create new conditions and difficulties for political actors and parties as well. This is a new beginning for Turkey's politics because there's a new system. And here the question is whether there will be new actors or not. We know that Erdogan is there. Erdogan is stronger than before. Why? Because there is a 5-year of stability and a majority of people's alliance. And then there will be transformations for improving common public policies of Turkey. Of course, there are economic problems, problems of fighting with terrorism, and at the same time, democratic consolidation. So all of these problems will be in the front of the alliance, People's Alliance, and at the same time, foreign policy and other security issues will be handled with this new system and the power of the new system. But still, working with one major difficulty, you have to establish a new system and institutionalize it, but at the same time, you have to solve your problems that are coming from the older system and from your 16 years period. So this is the main task in front of the government.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duran. And now we will move to our panelists in the room. And we will start with Mujeeb Khan. And can you tell us the perception of the elections in the United States a little bit?
Well, yes. I remember as soon as the elections results were announced, I had turned on CNN, and I was expecting the worst, and indeed the worst did happen. With incredible condescension and bias, the headline said, "Turkey turns towards authoritarianism," and then it went downhill from there. And then the news desk cut to a reporter in Ankara, and he said, "Turkey's headed towards authoritarianism, and Erdogan's supporters are out in the streets, and they're incoherent." And then the reporter turned to a woman to prove how incoherent the AKP supporters were. And she was holding a baby, very pleasant woman. She was wearing a headscarf. And she said in a very calm voice with a nice smile, "Ben de mutlu, çok mutlu." So apparently I'm happy, very happy, and that was it. So that was the incredible incoherence and so on. So the New York Times reported, of course, that, implied that Turkey's democracy was in peril, the elections were really democratic, and that and the opposition wasn't allowed to have rallies or demonstrations and get its views out. This is also not accurate. So this brings us to this question of, where does Turkey stand in terms of, say, democratic theory, right? How democratic is Turkey? Were these elections really democratic? But what about the flaws in Turkish democracy? Legitimate concerns that while the elections were fair, they may not have been completely free because it wasn't a level playing field. So these are all fair points to make. Unfortunately, certainly in the Western media accounts, none of the nuances and subtleties were there, and even in some academic or think tanks and so on, like there was a recent POMED's panel as well. So I think the main takeaway for me was that we need to acknowledge that Turkish democracy is flawed. It's weakly institutionalized. Turkey only emerged from military tutelage in the period of 2007 to 2010. So the institutional vacuum basically was, I think, the driving force for the coup attempt by the Gulenists in the military and in the state, which led to the state of emergency in Turkey. So those were problems, definitely, that existed. However, the elections were competitive in the sense that there was a great voter turnout, great voter interest. The opposition did face hurdles in getting its message across. It didn't get fair time on state broadcasting, but it did have a number of mainstream venues, both in television and print, to get its views across, and it did get, especially with the CHP leader, Muharrem İnce, did generate a great deal of enthusiasm. The election results in Turkey have been, since Turkey moved towards multi-party elections in 1950, fair and very well monitored. The Yüksek Seçim Kurumu, or the higher electoral commission, has always monitored these. You've always had representatives from the different parties. You've also had international observers in place. And in many ways, as far as conducting the balloting in Turkey, it's quite superior to the system we have in the U.S., where we've had, different polling stations and electoral officials spread out. We had the whole hanging chads issue. In one election, we have two elections where people who lost the popular vote quite decisively became presidents of the United States. And the hometown I come from, my hometown, Chicago, we had a mayor, Daley, who used to say, vote early and vote often. And during the Kennedy-Nixon elections, maybe up to 50,000 dead people voted, and many speculate that might have been the margin of victory for JFK. So my point is that we need to be critical of Turkey's democracy. It is a democracy, but it is a flawed democracy. It needs to become institutionalized. It needs checks and balances. It needs an independent judiciary. We need to move away from emergency rule now towards, we need, civil rights and liberties. But there's no room for condescension, certainly not given the difficulties we face today in the United States. We may be heading ourselves to a constitutional crisis. So that would be my takeaway.
Michael, do you want to follow up with him and say a few words about your take?
Sure. I think one of the things that always strikes me in so much of the media coverage and even much of the analysis of Turkey, is the mic on?
Yes.
Okay. Is a tendency to present Erdogan as the focus of U.S. problems. So there's the idea that if only Erdogan were not president of Turkey, everything would be so much better. And if Erdogan were to disappear, things would be vastly improved. That, I think, is a huge mistake. And that very much influences much of the coverage of the elections. The elections were not fair by any means, and I think Erdogan certainly deserves the criticism he's gotten from inside of Turkey and outside of that. I think that criticism should continue, but I think the election results were largely accurate. There were no claims of any substantial fraud. Erdogan does have a track record of winning elections. He is regarded as always been regarded as a very skilled politician. He's a phenomenal orator, and he's also very hardworking. The number of rallies that he held, it's not as if he sat in his palace and dictated, "I'm going to win this election." He worked for it, and he is popular. It was, I think, most analysts of Turkey recognize he was about 50% of the population is very strongly behind him. He won slightly over that in these elections. That says that there's almost half the country does not like him. And one of their problems has been that they have been disunited. I think one of the positive things about this election is that finally you saw some creativity and some life among the opposition. That is creativity. You had the cooperation between the Republican People's Party, the CHP, and this new party, the EE Party. You saw Muharrem İnce going and visiting the chairman of the HDP, Demirtas, in jail. These sorts of things would have been unthinkable earlier. And even the mere fact that İnce was a candidate, he had some charisma, he was able to get people energized. And I think this perhaps does bode well. I think Turkey, like any democracy, needs to have a strong opposition. If the opposition's weak, the people in power are always going to take as much as they can. So that is very important for Turkey, and I hope that the opposition, in all its various forms, does take useful lessons from this and strengthens themselves. To come back to my point that the Erdogan, this idea that if Erdogan weren't there, things would be vastly better with the U.S. One thing I think Americans have to recognize is anti-Americanism is strong in Turkey. It's always been there. Erdogan is not the source of it. Erdogan does fan it at times. He certainly can exploit it, but he is not, I don't think, the one who generates it. I think we should also keep in mind that Erdogan has proven himself as an excellent politician. He can be flexible when he recognizes when it's in his interests and Turkey's interests. And I would point to an example of foreign affairs, that of his relations with Israel. Certainly Erdogan, relations with Israel took a very sharp turn for the worse. And yet Erdogan has managed to repair relations with Israel. And currently, as I understand, they're fairly decent right now. And where it was the opposition, in fact, that was trying to make an issue of this and criticizing Erdogan on that. So the idea that sort of Erdogan, Turkish-American relations are only bound to get worse because Erdogan has been reelected, I don't see any reason to believe that. One final thing I think I'd like to touch on, right, in coming to the question a lot of people are asking in the U.S., is Turkey even an ally these days? And which is a fair enough question to ask, but I think when you ask it from the Turkish perspective, is the United States an ally? The evidence that the United States is not a reliable or good ally of Turkey is much stronger on the Turkish side. And in particular, I won't go into the details, but in particular, the arming and training of the YPG in Syria, which is an affiliate of the PKK. I think the simplest way and most accurate or most effective way to describe this to an American audience would be to say, imagine that you had Al-Qaeda affiliates in Mexico, and Turkey had decided, well, we're going to send them some arms, and in fact, we're going to train them, and we're going to work with them. And imagine if Al-Qaeda was responsible not for the deaths of, let's say, roughly 3,000 people in the United States, but something like 10 times that amount. How would the American people look at that? Would that even be a question? Is Turkey a reliable ally if they were arming and training Al-Qaeda in Mexico? And even that one could make the argument that that's not even a fair comparison insofar as Al-Qaeda has no territorial claims on America. This is an extraordinarily sensitive question. It's a very complex one. The Kurdish question. One of the things on this election, I thought perhaps it was a good thing that the HDP was able to pass the barrier and will be in parliament. I don't know if the HDP will be able to actually partner with any other parties in parliament. Certainly it seems that some people have the idea that maybe Erdogan, now that he is won these elections, he will be able to go back, as he did several years ago, and perhaps attempt to make an effort to resolve the Kurdish question. Erdogan, I think, is one of the few people in Turkey who there's any possibility of doing this. It's an extraordinarily difficult question. It needs a powerful and extraordinarily talented politician. Erdogan, right now, he's the only one who could do that. But I think that with the AKP being in alliance with the MHP, the strength of the MHP in this election, that seems difficult to imagine. I also don't know if there'd be any real possibility that the HDP will be able to collaborate with the other parties of the CHP, given that the E party is also in the opposition. So that will be something interesting to watch. I think that's unfortunate. I would like to see the HDP integrated into Turkish politics so that Turkish citizens of Kurdish background will understand we have a stake in the stability and development of this democracy. But that will remain to be seen. And maybe on right, and the other things making it with the strength of the MHP, you have the turbulence in Syria and potentially in Iraq as well, will make it, I think, very difficult for anyone, even including Erdogan, to really push for a major breakthrough on the Kurdish question side of Turkey, which I think is very unfortunate. Maybe there's a small glimmer of hope, but all hope's not lost, but I'm not especially encouraged after these elections.
Thank you very much. And I was looking, we are preparing an analysis for the elections actually, and we are looking at the maps that HDP, the areas that HDP lost votes. Actually, HDP lost votes almost all of the mostly Kurdish populated areas in southeast and eastern part of Turkey. And most of the votes that it gained was from the other parts of Turkey, which was mostly tactical votes from the mostly CHP to put the HDP in parliament so that AK Party will not gain the majority. And this is a downward trend since the actually June 2015 elections, in which a lot of Turkish voters and liberal left actually gave an opportunity for HDP. And since then, they are quite a bit losing the votes. And the votes were lower than the referendum votes in most of the areas. And compared to November 2015, places like Hakkari, they lost 14%. So these are huge margins of loss for HDP. And the fourth panelist actually with Burhanettin Duran, Professor Serwer, and later Ambassador Jeffrey will talk about the future of Turkish-American elections. Can you start, Dr. Serwer, about your take for the future of Turkish-US relations?
Look, I don't see the elections as having been either free or fair, but Erdogan won them. And he has an enhanced presidency, a coalition majority in parliament. In effect, controls most of the judiciary and the press as well. Opposition is fragmented. Maybe it will play a constructive role, but I think it's going to be very difficult. To me, Turkey looks headed deeper into one-man rule, even if Erdogan lifts his pledge to, fulfills his pledge to lift the emergency. I think it'd be foolish to imagine that Erdogan will suddenly become generous to his enemies, end the crackdown on over 100,000 alleged coup plotters, break with the Russians, refocus attention on fighting Islamic extremism and qualifying for EU membership, negotiate peace with Turkey's Kurds, patch up the alliance with the US. Those are all the things that the Americans might like. Frankly, I wonder if he would even restrain his bodyguards the next time he comes to Washington. The question is, what do we do about this? How do we make it through the coming years, possibly even a decade or more, with an erstwhile ally moving in a direction that I really find it very hard to like? The current occupant of the White House makes these questions even more difficult than they normally would be. He's on the outs with Erdogan as one of the very few autocratically focused leaders with whom he is on the outs, but not over human rights or relations with Russia. Trump and Erdogan might agree entirely on those issues. But President Trump has continued to insist on supporting the Syrian Kurds and hasn't proven much help on the extradition of Gulen, which are the two things Erdogan seems to care most about. Ironically, the best approach is one I think Trump might find attractive: a more transactional relationship that relies less on Turkey as an ally and more on its usefulness to the US. Let's go to basics. The most important aspect of that usefulness is geography. The insular air base is important to US operations throughout the Levant. So long as it remains available, we're going to have to try to improve relations with Erdogan, who fortunately gets real benefits from that base and those operations. In addition, as Syria's northern neighbor with a long common border, Turkey hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees. The US has spent around $600 million to support them, and in my view, needs to continue that effort, which benefits Turkey in some way. The immediate crunch issue for a transactional relationship is the sale of the F-35s to Ankara, which Congress is trying to stop. In my view, what's needed is a compromise, one that ends Erdogan's threat to buy the S-400 Russian air defenses while allowing the transfer of the F-35s. Secretary Mattis is said to be working a deal of that sort. Personally, I can't help but wonder whether a Patriot sale, which apparently we've refused so far, might also be something Erdogan still wants. The question of Syrian Kurds is next. Seems to me the Minbish agreement appears to be working so far and needs to be completed, probably with some reformulation of the governing body there and withdrawal of some of the Kurdish forces east of the Euphrates. I think while I don't entirely agree that there's an analogy with Mexico, I do think Erdogan has a legitimate complaint about the failure of the Kurds to move east of Minbish and our failure to deliver them to that. Much tougher will be the issue of prisoner releases. Ankara holds dozens of Americans, apparently hoping to trade them for Gulen. It's apparently hard to convince Erdogan, though I'm sure our ambassador has tried, that Trump doesn't have the same power over Gulen's fate that Erdogan has over the Americans Turkey holds. If, however, a court decides in favor of extradition, which depends heavily on the evidence that Turkey produces, I have my doubts the Trump administration, which has an opportunity to stand in the way, would do so. I think they would allow it. This is, I'm afraid, how we'll need to proceed. Issue by issue, looking for trades we can reasonably do that Erdogan will find attractive. It will be a hard slog, wondering which concern about human rights abuses will likely find little public expression. I nevertheless hope the administration will make a strong case in private against Erdogan's continued crackdown. All but the immediate coup plotters should be freed, Kurdish political leaders and journalists should be released and amnestied or pardoned, jobs should be restored. The strongest potential leverage the Americans have now on human rights in Turkey is, I think, economic. The Turkish economy is headed in a bad direction. It will be made much worse if secondary sanctions against Iran are instituted. Relief from secondary sanctions could be traded for easing the crackdown, but Trump isn't likely to do that. Erdogan will have strong incentives to surreptitiously violate the sanctions, which he did even during the Obama era. My bottom line is that Erdogan has won, Trump is in power, elections have consequences.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Jeffrey?
Yeah, it's always hard to be the, counting the moderator, fifth speaker, and everybody's already said everything. So I'll just pick little bits and pieces to try to augment and complement what people are saying. First of all, the one-man rule thing. I was so frustrated with this that I went back and read for maybe the umpteenth time the new Constitution. Now, bear in mind, constitutions, as we're experiencing every day in the United States, are only as good as the will of the political leadership to adhere to them and to enforce violations from them. So with that caveat, let me try to explain why this isn't one-man rule, but it is different. And it isn't, well, we don't have a prime minister. You know, France has a prime minister. How many of you know his name or her name? Okay, I rest my case. France has a presidential system. In one major way, because it's constantly raised, the Constitution goes in a more liberal parliamentary direction, and that is the state of emergency now is required to be implemented by a parliamentary majority, not by the president. And there's a lot of powers that come with that, and we'll see what happens the next time that comes up. Now, Erdogan's people are talking about ending it. Baceli is not talking about ending it, but again, it'll be a question of what Parliament does. In general, though, the shift is, and it's interesting because it's as if Erdogan predicted what had happened. Other than that brief period of time after June 2015, Erdogan, for the first time, is faced with an AKP minority in parliament, right at the very time when, under the new constitution, that's less important. It isn't unimportant, but it's less important because of the dynamic of the system now versus the old system. The charm of the old system, Erdogan's argument, and having lived through that Turkey on 3 tours, I have some sympathy for it, is that the old system gave primary power to the parliament, which didn't work very well because it was internally divided. And for anything to happen, you had to get a majority. The system is now reversed by and large, and the president has much more authority, and parliament's authority becomes more, if you want to change government policy, you have to come up with a majority in Parliament. Right now, that means all four parties other than the AKP. That's not impossible. It's potentially feasible on some issues, but it's not easy to do. And that's the deliberate intention of the Constitution, which is to allow the president to rule by decree, absent a absolute majority, 301 people in the Parliament, who pass a law blocking him or his successor from doing one of those things. Whether that's a good system or a bad system is hard to decide. It depends on each country's individual experience. The Germans, based on their experience with a parliamentary system that turned out much worse than the former Turkish parliamentary system did, essentially put into the Constitution something called the Konstruktive Misstrauensvotum, which means that you have to get a majority ready to install a new chancellor before you can dump the current chancellor. So it's somewhat the same thing. In a perfect world, it would be really none of our business to judge this Constitution to the extent as allies, friends, and as fellow signers of the UN Charter Preamble, along with Turkey, we have a right to see how a democratic system is actually executed in practice, and that's something that, as Dan and others have said, we should do, and I'm sure we will do. But normally we wouldn't be picking apart countries' constitutions and weighing how democratic they are. So why do we do this? A couple of reasons that are both Turkey-specific and America-specific. One is, in looking at the extraordinary reaction to everybody, and we've already heard plenty of examples of that, and I could spend the next hour citing my own set. Folks, some of this is frustration and real fear of Donald Trump flowing into an assessment of Erdogan, because Erdogan seems to be a leader in the pattern of Donald Trump. Illiberal, not a believer in pluralism, not a particularly strong fan of rule of law, the media, and other things that many Americans, for good reason, hold dear. And therefore, some of the one-sidedness of the criticism, I think, reflects that. The other one is just the polished state, not of the relationship. I'm actually more positive than Dan. I think the relationship actually is working on one of the three areas that is very important, which is the northern Syria Manbij situation. I think the second one, the Fethullah Gulen thing, it's working better, and I'm just not convinced that it is a high priority for the Turkish government to get this guy back, particularly given this guy's former relationship with this administration, the AK party. And then the third thing, which Dan was right to hammer on a bit, is the S-400. So why this, gnashing of teeth and tearing of nails about the relationship? A couple of reasons. One is the United States, and this term ally keeps coming up. That's a code word for us inside the government and in the academic and think tank and congressional circles that focus on foreign affairs. And it means allies are people who do what we say because we know better than they do what's good for them. And we certainly know better than they do what's good for us. And what's good for us is, by definition, what's good for them. Now, when you're running a global collective security system with a hell of a lot of sacrifice, which America's been doing for the last 70 years, I have a certain sympathy for this attitude. It's just that it does not work with powerful leaders who are willing to be partners but not lackeys. We had this experience with Charles de Gaulle. And when people compare Erdogan to Putin or worse, my rejoinder is no, he's a lot like Charles de Gaulle. When you need him, he's there. When we needed somebody to put a radar as the very spine of our anti-ballistic missile system against Iran, Erdogan did it. For 3 years, when we needed, because Obama decided for good reason it was a priority to defeat ISIS in Syria, the Turks went along with our arming and equipping the PYD, even though they knew, we knew, and they knew we knew the relationship between the PYD and the PKK. And in fact, operating the close air support, including A-10 squadrons out of Incirlik in support of the PYD. In fact, I made a huge mistake. I felt terrible about it after it happened. In one congressional testimony, I was, as usual, trying desperately to say something positive about Turkey. And so I mentioned this, how we were supporting the joint operations against ISIS out of Incirlik. So Akşener somehow picked up on it and went public saying, look what this American is saying, throw the Americans out of Incirlik today. So Erdogan supported that. Where he got very upset was when suddenly our temporary, tactical, and transactional relationship with the PYD, based on a Tillerson speech and some comments by Secretary Mattis, but most importantly, a news release by, I guess it's called the Coalition, but it was basically CENTCOM, clearing it with nobody, about a border force in a long-term relationship with this PYD post defeating ISIS, and nobody had cleared that with the Turks. That was a total blow-up of our whole basis for the cooperation with them, and the reaction we all know. And it's taken us 6 months, and a minor not so minor campaign in Afrin to get this thing fixed, but it has gotten fixed. I'll stop on the following point. Because there is this tremendous talking past each other, important things are sometimes missed. And this talking past each other is no fault of either side. The last time I had a conversation with President Erdogan, obviously, Turkey's relationship with the United States came up. And I assured him, and I think I was correct, that no leader gets more attention in Washington, with the possible exception of Putin, than Erdogan. The problem is it's not necessarily good attention. And it's the same thing in Turkey. No one puts more effort into reaching out to the United States in terms of inputs than the Turkish government, Turkish institutions. We have SETA, and we have a half a dozen other institutions here. Government, anti-government, AK Party, other parties. The number of Turks who flow through here is extraordinary. Every time Erdogan or Yildirim or Çavuşoğlu or anybody else comes through town, they sit down and meet with large numbers of people. I know of no other government that puts this much money and effort into it. There's lobbying efforts and everything else. So the inputs really work well, but the outputs don't, in part because we talk past each other. For example, there's 50 issues that you can point to that the U.S. or somebody in the U.S. or somebody on an editorial board is upset about, and Turkey gets resentful at trying to fix them, just like we get resentful at the long list of Turkish irritations at us. But every once in a while, there are a few things that are important, and Dan touched on both of them. The S-400 thing is really important, not because of this congressional diktat. How dare anybody, particularly a NATO ally, buy anything from the Russians? I mean, this is the kind of foolish stuff we do. And we'll see whether we do this to Saudi Arabia, India, and a few other places that are major markets for U.S. weapons. But the S-400 with the F-35, there is a specific intelligence technical problem that is huge. And there's a real danger having its crying wolf. Having blasted Erdogan either through our government officials and press statements and all of that, or through the media and such, for everything under the sun, it may be that he's missing the point that this is something that doesn't have an easy fix. It does have a fix, as Dan said. There's several options that people are looking at, but they're all hard, and they all involve Erdogan and Trump both signing up for them, and that means focus. The other thing is the pass to Brunson. This is particularly sensitive in part because Erdogan made it worse by making an explicit link between Brunson and Fethullah Gulen, but more importantly, the power of evangelicals in America should not be taken lightly. And that's simply the way we tick as a country, and certainly the way this administration ticks. So somehow when the dust settles from this election campaign and we try to move forward on the relationship, these two things are the top priorities. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Normally, I have a second round of questions for the panelists, but considering that there may be a lot of questions from the audience, I will now open the floor for questions. Then following that, if we have time, I will have a set of questions for our panelists. Let's collect some questions. Let's start with the gentleman. Can we bring the mic here? Yeah.
Thank you. Herb Rose. Can't we and shouldn't we tell Erdogan that you have a choice of either taking the S-400 or the F-35? Not only Erdogan, but as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, India, shouldn't we say the same thing to them? In particular, in Turkey's situation, they're part of NATO. And originally, as I understand it, at any rate, NATO was formed as a foil for the Soviet Union. So there's some historical basis there. But shouldn't we say you have a choice of one or the other?
No. First of all, you're actually correct, and I'll get to it, but I'm going to get to it in a wrong way because you're correct for the wrong reasons. The assumption, and this is Congress's assumption, is that, you're either our friend or our enemy. You're with us or against us. It sounds familiar from George Bush in 2003 or 2001. And this is the default position the government sometimes and Congress most of the time takes. Why can't, forget Turkey, why can't India buy S-400s? Every time we pressed the U.S. Air Force to do more in Syria, what we would hear back would be, oh, the Syrian S-300 system is so dangerous. If this thing is so good, why can't India have it? Who are we to tell another country who they can buy weapons from? Oh, seriously. Now, you made a point, though, and it's NATO. First of all, there's the inconvenient thing that NATO has formally declared that Russia is no longer our enemy. And it has a founding act with Russia and has a Russian ambassador at NATO. Now, you and I know that relations are pretty bad now since Georgia, but still, that's the technical reason. So, again, and there's nothing in the NATO alliance that says that you're forbidden from buying weapons from the Russians. Now, there's two problems. One, the lesser problem is that for all kinds, well, both of them tie into the fact that the Russians, with a Russian weapon system, you're going to get Russian technical personnel and Russian intelligence personnel, and the system is going to be set up to soak up any intelligence it can have. And because Russia is a potential enemy of NATO, nobody wants that to happen. So the first problem with buying an S-400 is it really cannot be made compatible with the rest of NATO's systems. The NATO air defense system is primarily a Patriot-based system and air defense fighters and various radars and other things. And it's one of the more sophisticated and the more integrated elements of NATO. And you really can't put S-400s in the middle of it. Now, NATO has deployed Patriots to, including American Patriots, to Turkey 3 times, 1991, 2003, and during the Syrian crisis. So we have repeatedly helped Turkey on its air defense thing. And so this is kind of, I mean, it's hard for me to defend it on the basis of national sovereignty, I have to, but I feel bad about the S-400 one because there's one where NATO has been very, very accommodating, and Turkey's buying a system that will not allow it to deploy to Poland or deploy to the Baltics, although Turkey has a responsibility to do it. So that's the first thing, but that isn't as serious as the main problem, which is the F-35. Now, Saudi Arabia and India, as far as I know, are not buying F-35, so that isn't a problem. We're investing in some 2,200 or more F-35s for our own military and many, many hundreds more for our allies. It is the basic combat system for the United States and all of its allies. So it's the most important toy we have, and we have to protect that from Russian intelligence coming in through the back door, and there'll be plenty of back doors in the S-400. That's the technical problem, but it is extremely important. It's also in Turkey's interest. Given that the last time a Turkish aircraft shot down another aircraft, it was a Russian aircraft, do the Turks really want the Russians to know everything about their operating electronics and codes? I don't think so.
Daniel, you want it?
Just along those lines, I don't think there's any hope at all that an S-400 system provided by the Russians is ever going to shoot down a Russian aircraft. It just ain't going to happen. But I do think Turkey has air defense needs. And what puzzles me, maybe somebody knows, Jim, why do we not sell Patriot?
We're willing to now. The question is, and it's one that the Turks have raised, because we sent a whole delegation out when I was last out there talking about this. The problem is, back in the early days, there was either, no, we won't sell them, or we will sell them only under these conditions. This gets to very complicated Turkish defense industrial priorities versus what the U.S. FMS system is willing to support. I suspect it was more on that basis, because we sold Patriots to Saudi Arabia, we sold them to Israel, we sold them to Gulf states, we sold them to many NATO allies. I don't think there was a refusal to sell Patriots. I think there was a refusal to sell Patriots with source codes, with co-production, with various other things that the industrial military undersecretariat of the Turkish government makes as their priorities. But that's just surmise.
Ragıp.
Ragıp Soylu, Daily Sabah. I have two questions actually. First, would you elaborate on the congressional dicta that you were mentioning about? What do you mean by that? And secondly, Turkish officials say they won't allow Russian technicians to get into Turkey. And secondly, they say they will create their own software, so they won't use Russian software. And they also say they're not going to connect the S-400 to the Russian or the NATO system. And considering all those options, do you think it's still suitable to have S-400s in there? And they also say Israel, as you know, owns F-35s, and they were flying near Syria, and you have S-400s deployed in southern Syria, basically intercepted by it. So what would you say? Thank you.
Israel has been very careful about flying F-35s over Syria. For exactly, I think, for exactly this reason. And on Congress, somebody else want to take that?
You want to say a few words, Major?
Well, yes. I mean, the S-400 system is in Syria. The U.S. has been flying F-22s there. As you mentioned, Israel has been flying its F-35s. So, and the technical data collection goes both ways. The U.S., in fact, is testing the Russian systems. The Russians are testing the U.S. systems. So this idea that somehow the technology automatically gets turned over, or the ability to neutralize these stealth aircraft is exaggerated. I think the broader question is, from the Turkish perspective, is that Turkey has very legitimate reasons to insist that it has source codes and control over weapon systems that defend its airspace. Whether it's getting them from Russia, Turkey is going to be very careful in making sure that it limits as much as possible Russian backdoors or attempts to kill switches and so on. But the same Turkish concerns apply to the F-35 system from the US as well. Turkey's insisting on source codes. Turkey is looking at a potential Israeli-Greek, Greek-Cypriot alliance that it needs to be able to defend against. And it's not sure it will because the Israelis are applying pressure to deny source codes for the Turkish F-35s separate from this S-400 deal. So this, I think, is the crux of the issue that we're not addressing. Turkey cannot be treated like the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Egypt. It's a far, far more powerful country. It's a historic leader of the Muslim world. I would say it's the pivotal country in the emerging multipolar global balance of power. If you're familiar with the theories, geostrategic theories of Alfred Mackinder or Karl Haushofer, what you're seeing is what's emerging today with China's One Belt, One Road initiative, Russia's desire for a Eurasian Union. Turkey is the one country in the international system that can tilt the balance of power because of its size, because of its soft power in the Islamic world, and its geostrategic location. And yet, the United States is still trapped because of domestic political lobbies tied to Israel in viewing Turkey as if it's one of these other smaller countries in the Middle East. It's not. And then there's the broader issue of basically the crisis in American policy in the Islamic world, the forever wars, the long war, whatever you want to call it, the U.S. is bogged down in. The long-term solution is you're going to have to go towards socioeconomic development, the emergence of middle classes, democratization. The Arab Spring held that promise. Obama started off on the right track and then fecklessly snatched defeat from the jaws of victory with the coup in Egypt, also in terms of the Syrian uprising. Now that was coordinated by the Israelis, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And that's come to bite the US in terms of interference in our own democratic process, as we've seen. But I think that's the broader issue that needs to be addressed, the crisis in Turkish-American relations. It needs to be separate from what's happening with the UAE, Israel, and
I will follow up there. And before going back to the audience, so everybody knows that the relation is in crisis. It is getting better, but there is a set of problems. And we know now that there are 5 years of Erdogan government. So if two countries have both sides, the leaders seem to have, after the phone call the day before yesterday, intention to repair ties and restore the strategic partnership in a level that both countries have a win-win situation. And considering this set of problems, where should the two countries start solving the problems? Let's start with Michael.
Where should Turkey and the U.S. start solving the problems? Wow.
Or what should they do? You can consider public opinion, like whatever you want.
I mean, just speaking very broadly, looking at it from the American side, and I don't know, I can't speak to what goes on day to day between diplomats, particularly nor with the military. And obviously, these are key factors. But Mujeeb actually made a very good point in terms of media coverage, the condescension, which I don't think is restricted only to the media. I think this is something, I don't want to say inherent to Americans, but I think that most Americans kind of look at the rest of the world. We're very comfortable with the idea that we are the center of the world, and we see the future of the rest of the world become like us. And what's history is history. So why would anyone take any interest in that? And the belief, I think, still is largely, certainly it was when I started studying Turkey, was that Turkey is kind of a third world country. And that means it's kind of like all the others, doesn't have much of history or anything. And overlooking the fact that this was, which you mentioned, it was a great imperial power, ruled over the Middle East for 400 years, had a dynasty that was over 6 centuries in length, truly a great civilization. Much of that still remains inside of Turkey. And that then they have historical memory that's much older than Americans. And the American assumption, well, everybody must kind of love us. I think this is another thing the Americans assume. And we know that now this is not the case in dealing with Turkey, but I think many Americans are still puzzled. Why is that? And we're put off by it. And so I suppose maybe the start, I think, again, this maybe sounds quite banal, particularly coming from a professor of Middle Eastern and Ottoman history, but say Americans should know more about Turkey and its history in the region. And that will also, of course, give greater insights to things like the Kurdish question, which again is not a simple one, and yeah, so maybe I'll leave it to that, because I think the other panelists might have more specific ideas in the short term that could be used to improve relations, other than this general idea that Americans should perhaps step back a second and not start out with condescension. Turks don't really know what they're doing. And you see a lot of this is written in the histories of the Middle East. Sort of the Middle Easterners sort of presents as buffoons who can't really understand their own best interests. And that's just never a good place to start. And sometimes that is the case, but that can also apply to Americans as well. It can apply to anybody. I think the first step to start with analysis is the assumption, okay, maybe the other person knows what they are doing and knows what they need to do. And then start with that assumption, and then you might say they don't, but at the same time, one has to keep an eye on double check is when do we ourselves know what we're doing and what we want to do and need to do?
I know it's a hard question, because both in Turkey and in United States, when they ask this question, I also have that blue screen moment thinking, to organize and come up with some ideas about that. Professor Serwer, you have...
I think I've made myself clear.
Yeah.
I think we have to approach issues one by one and try to improve them. Air defenses is first, Syrian Kurds second, I would say. Prisoners third. I would try to remove some of these irritants. I might like the idea that all Americans should know more about the Ottomans and Turkey's role in the world, but I despair of the likelihood of that happening.
We can try.
Yeah,
More funding.
again, in terms of point issues,
Yeah.
I would vote for the S-400 and Parson Brunson, but irritants is too weak a word to use, because these have such resonance for the reasons that we've talked about here, but they are basically just one issue. The key relationship and the biggest problem we've had with Turkey since 2011 is the situation to its south. The Middle East is under tremendous stress, primarily by Iran and its expansionist tendencies, enabled to some degree, and we're testing the limits of that degree right now with Russia, and Islamic Sunni jihadist reaction largely to that Iranian expansion, which we saw in ISIS. And Turkey is fundamentally impacted because of the fact that at the end of the day, Turkey is a status quo power that benefits from and is basically not trying hard. That's where I would disagree with this idea of a Eurasian player. And there are a lot of Turks, including in the military, who see that way. I just don't see it. I don't think it has the soft power. It doesn't have what Iran has in the region, which are essentially colonies of Shia that you can rely on. It doesn't have what Russia has in the region. So Turkey winds up being, in the end, a defensive status quo state. What it has is really good. Look at how its economy has grown. Look at how it has maintained security with Ukraine to the north and Syria and Iraq to the south. That's a real accomplishment, and it's been done through work with the West, with the EU, with the United States. And so I think that the bias is to stay a status quo country, but the status quo is being challenged by Iran and Russia, and on the margins by these various jihadist groups, and that all comes together to Syria, to Turkey's south, particularly in Syria. There, its position has been relatively constant. The United States' position has been back and forth. Remember, it was Obama who talked Erdogan into opposing so strongly Assad back in 2011. Then we did joint operations with the Free Syrian Army. Then we lost interest and went away. So that was the first blow to Erdogan. Then we got interested in being in Syria only to fight ISIS, and Erdogan was uncomfortable with that, but he went along with it. I mean, this guy's been disappointed with us repeatedly. But Syria is really, and Iran are really very, very important issues, and that's a strategic and Russia in the Middle East. Those are three areas where the United States and Turkey can work together, and it's all to secure both the region, to maintain the status quo, and to secure Turkey's southern borders. So that's what I hope we can put our priorities into.
Thank you. Mujeeb, I will get back to you, but I will collect another set of questions. Yes, Tuna. Let's start with Tuna first. You're here. And there's a question at the back, I guess, right? The gentleman after that.
Thank you. Tuna Şanlı from TRT. Mr. Ambassador, I have two questions for you. The second question is for everybody, I think. In fact, the first question is the follow-up of question of Ragıp. What do you mean by congressional dicta about the crisis?
Congressional what?
Dicta. You said S-400, F-35 crisis. You talked about a congressional dicta. What do you mean by saying this? And the second question is your future perspective on Syria's strategy, because there's a roadmap agreed between both countries in Manbij, and they will start joint patrols in Manbij. But at the same time, the United States says it is very confident in YPG, and the partnership between United States and YPG will continue. So will the roadmap help to resolve the crisis in Syria between the two countries, or should we expect a more deterioration in relations in Syria because of the YPG support to the YPG by the US government? The second question is for all, especially for you. And the first question, again, the congressional dicta.
Was there another question over there?
Thank you. Herbert Regenbogen, professor of international law at Turtle Law Center. My question is to Professor Serwer and Ambassador Jeffrey. In context of the dynamics of the economy, which is suffering unfathomably in terms of a recovery, we are expecting the United States Treasury to levy a fine of unprecedented amounts, speculative of $10 billion because of the violation by the Hakbank in money laundering. How is this going to impede the relationship between US and Turkey? And how will the MKP play this off for their interests? As they are Eurosceptics and they are very isolationist in their platform.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, let's collect all of the questions because this would be.
Hello, Alexandra Choate. Yesterday, at a discussion held by the Brookings Institute, a panelist mentioned the uncertainty of Turkish initiatives in Cyprus. I was curious as to whether you have any predictions for future relationships between the two nations.
Any other? Okay. Let's start this last. Ambassador, you got a few questions.
I want to distinguish between two congressional actions. One is the most recent language in the NDAA, which raises the issue of the S-400 vis-a-vis the F-35. That's not a diktat, that's Congress doing its job. There is a real danger of the F-35 system being compromised, and that's the core of the specific issue between Turkey and the United States on the S-400. It's the F-35 technical and intelligence aspects of it. The diktat came in the 2017 Russia Sanctions Act. That was basically passed primarily aimed at Trump. That's the one that passed 99-0 in the Senate, so it was veto-proof. And that's the one that says nobody anywhere can buy Russian, if anybody anywhere buys Russian weapons, the United States will cut off all weapon sales to that country. That's a diktat. And that's also, from the standpoint of American military industrial policy, that's crazy. I mean, particularly as one country that we sell even more to than Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and a country we really want to sell more to, and are looking to, as a strategic partner, India, are caught up in this along with several other countries. So that's the diktat. But there's nothing wrong with Congress saying we're not going to allow F-35s to be transferred to Turkey if Turkey has S-400s, because that is a real problem. It's acknowledged by everybody I've talked to in the U.S. military who knows the subject.
How about the Syria question?
The Syria question, I was hoping to avoid that. Look, Manbij is a good thing because Manbij has become a symbol, but Manbij is not very important. It's in the middle of nowhere. It was important in the fight against ISIS when it was essentially the gateway to Raqqa back in 2015, 2016, which is why we in the SDF went across the Euphrates to take it. And it was also important to both the PYD and to Turkey because there was an effort related to that to link all of the Kurdish areas that the PYD controlled in northern Syria, and Turkey thus intervened in Euphrates Shield just to the northwest of Manbij to block that. But essentially because the western half of the PYD controlled Syria no longer is controlled by the PYD, it's controlled by Turkey, Afrin. The strategic importance of Manbij has dropped, but nonetheless it has symbolic value for all three sides, Turkey, the United States, and the PYD, which is why it's been so long coming to pass. Carrying it out, and I'm very confident it will be, the agreement will be carried out, will build up confidence certainly between the U.S. and Turkey, and we'll see the impact on the PYD if the PYD, which I think it will go along with it. But the bigger problem is, what do you do with northeastern Syria? President Erdogan, quite reasonably, is opposed to the United States leaving. And he's made that point clear. And yet President Trump wants to leave. Well, what happens to the PYD after then? What's the relationship of the PYD to Turkey? What's the relationship to the PYD to the Syrian government? And how does this affect all of the larger questions in Syria? That's an important question. My recommendation is you default to what we have right now. That is, for the moment, you continue the ceasefire between the PYD and Turkey. The United States stays in the northeast, and the U.S. and Turkey work on, because collectively you're talking about 40% of the territory of Turkey, and rather of Syria, in the hands of Turkey, the U.S., or their on-the-ground allies, and probably 30% of the population either in the Turkish-controlled areas, the U.S.-controlled areas, or as refugees in Turkey. So you cannot have a resolution of the Syrian crisis and a final political determination under UN Security Council Resolution 2254 until that 30 to 40% of Syrian population and territory is reintegrated into Syria in one way, shape, or form, which gives the U.S. and Turkey considerable leverage if they're willing to do it. I believe Turkey's more willing to do it than the United States. So right now, a cooperative effort would be more on persuading the United States to stay on and to work together with Turkey and other countries to try to get some kind of an acceptable solution to Syria, which doesn't keep this horrible, horrible war going on and going in other directions.
I might just add that I think there's a real possibility that the U.S. will withdraw.
Yeah, I do too.
And in what Turkey has to think about is how it deals with that scenario. It's quite clear why Erdogan wants the Americans to stay, because there's some constraint on the PYD, YPG. If the U.S. withdraws, the natural inclination of the PYD will be to revert to support by Damascus and to be used as a tool in undermining Turkish stability by Damascus. What this suggests to me is that Turkey needs to think about the unthinkable, which is developing a different relationship with the PYD. Now, Turkey developed for a little while, a different relationship with Öcalan. It's not impossible to talk with your enemies and even to find some areas of common cause with them. And I think all things considered, it would be smarter on Ankara's part at this point to be thinking about changing its attitude towards the PYD than continuing its hostile attitude towards the PYD.
Daniel, do you want to say a few words about Cyprus? Do you see any chance of reconciliation or any agreement?
It's the classic frozen conflict. It's so well managed that it's not causing either side much pain at this point. And every time you have an initiative and it fails the way the last one did, it becomes more difficult, not less difficult. But what harm is it causing at this point? Turks and Greeks on Cyprus are living reasonably normal lives. It wouldn't be what I would choose for Cyprus, but why would I care?
Michael, the last words about the future of Turkish foreign or domestic politics. Any words that you want to say before we close the panel?
Well, again, that's these open-ended questions. Again, the things that are rushing to my mind are all the banalities of this. Turkey's in a very difficult neighborhood. Turkey itself has been going through a very difficult time. One thing I think we should keep, I guess maybe this be words to American analysts and those who follow Turkey. For a long time, we took Turkey for granted in many ways. Erdogan's has really surprised us in a number of ways. The thing I think that has me most worried about Turkey's future has been the decline in the rule of law. And Erdogan certainly deserves a lot of blame for that, but not just Erdogan. There are a lot of other factors. Fethullah Gulen is another one, and I should just mention maybe as an American citizen, whether or not we extradite him to Turkey, I'd much like to see him stand trial in the United States for the systemic fraud that his group is engaged in the United States in the schools. It's a mystery to me why that was in so many states in this country. It was getting attention, and then suddenly it disappeared. So he has a lot to answer before the American people, those who let him stay here. So in his role and of those very close to him, which we know for a fact people very close to him did play a role in the coup. I find it very difficult to believe that he did not have an important role in that coup, but I could be wrong on that, but we do know that people close to him. So this is the decline of the rule of law inside of Turkey worries me. And the amount of, and certainly this has been one of Erdogan's goals, has been to reshape Turkey and its institutions. How will that, given all the turbulence that's been inside of Turkey, I don't know where is this going to lead to. And in particular, we could talk about a lot of different institutions, but one critical one has always been the military. And the military, when so many Americans for a long time during the Cold War looked at Turkey, first and foremost, they thought of the Turkish military and saw it as a very efficient organization, a very effective one. That was also seen as being pro-Western, reliable, and it is sort of the school of the Turkish nation, and it will have the idea of the military acting as a modernizing influence on Turkey. What the military has gone through in the last decade, the last 15 years, so I think if I were a military officer, first when the Ergenekon trials were going on, et cetera, what would you do if you're a mid-career officer? You'd say, I have no idea what's going on. I'm just going to do exactly what I'm told and not think creatively at all. Then you have, then those trials are overturned, officers are released, only creates more confusion about what's really going on. Then you have the coup, which further destroys, the amount of trust inside the military with the public, with politicians. You now have a new military education system. So one of the questions I have is, for any institution, but particularly a military institution that's gone through so many challenges and so much upheaval, can it recover and rebuild itself in the course of the next decade? So that would be one thing I would keep my eye on. I think that's very important, obviously, to given all the conflicts going on outside of Turkey, inside of Turkey. That's very important, I think, for Americans to have a better grasp of that. And I think it's also very great importance to Turkey. And maybe one last thing, one way I might propose that American-Turkish relations be improved would be, I understand that the exchange of military officers, Turkish military officers with the United States has declined. And that is something that I think is certainly I'd want to see more of, that is Turkish military officers being educated in the United States, collaborating with Americans, and vice versa. Those having that knowledge, both militaries of each other, and professional knowledge, but also then the personal relationships, which during moments of crisis can be so important. And so that, I suppose, to close on, that's that one small, and it should be possible to do that, would be to encourage, again, military to military contacts.
Mujeeb, last 1 minute.
Okay. My main point would be to say that fundamentally, U.S.-Turkish interest and relations are congruent in the broader region. And what's happening is, and we really need to approach this from a broader and grand historical and grand strategic perspective. The Sykes-Picot-Sazonov arrangement in the Middle East as a century ago is falling apart. The Arab Spring process, there's a counter-revolution organized, as I said, by the Israelis, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. But again, just like in 1848, this counter-revolution is only a temporary setback. The fundamental demands for representative and accountable government, the use of resources for developing middle classes, and so on. All of this is going to continue. That crisis is not going to be over. And therefore, Turkey is a pivotal country in that sense, bringing modernity, development, stability to the Islamic world. But the important thing is Turkey cannot be treated as a client state. It's not a client state. And this has been the great pitfall in American policy. America is an immensely powerful country, but it's a very weak state. If you look at theories of like Mansur Olson's logic of collective action and so on, the U.S. is penetrated by special interest groups. And this has been, even during the Cold War, you had the Greek and Armenian lobbies and so on. This was a tremendous factor in souring Turkish-American relations, even though the national interests and strategic interests of both countries were congruent. The same thing is happening presently. And I think the burden is on the part of the American government, the American state, to insulate its relations with Turkey from special interest groups who have their own agendas. And we have a bunch of think tanks here in this city with people who are promoting, scholars and so on, who sort of editorial pages we talked about. That's part of this broader picture. But it's important for the professional American diplomatic corps and its representatives to understand it's their responsibility to insulate this vital relationship from those kinds of pressures, and to look and consider that the long-term strategic objectives of a democratic Turkey bringing modernity to the Islamic world is fundamentally congruent with American interests.
Thank you very much. Please join me thanking our panelists, also Burhanettin Duran, and I hope we can see you again. Thank you.